you mentioned Harvard, and I had mentioned Kissinger. What went through your mind sitting in Henry Kissinger's class?
Taking a course from Henry Kissinger, it was 1962. Henry Kissinger wasn't Henry Kissinger yet.
American Jewish University has a long legacy of political discourse, of exploring meaning, of exploring those issues with vigor and rigor that define our lives. And with that spirit in mind, we couldn't be happier to be having this conversation this evening. So, with that said, it's my pleasure to introduce the longtime newspaper columnist, television and radio broadcaster. She has a share of 2 Pulitzer Prizes, as well as 6 individual Emmys, 11 Golden Mike Awards, among other honors. Her nonfiction book, Rio, LA, Tales from the Los Angeles River, was a bestseller, and her fiction and nonfiction appear in several anthologies. Please welcome Pat Morrison.
Thank you, Josh. Thank you.
And while she's taking a seat, a reminder to turn your cell phones off, and that if you're going to take a picture,
Barney Frank, born in Massachusetts. His grandparents were immigrants from Poland and Russia. His father ran a truck stop, and he went to Harvard, where he once studied with Henry Kissinger, and I'm sure there's some good stories about that. His political stamp was imprinted early on. On a college visit to Jim Crow, South Carolina, he drank from the colored-only water fountain. We would expect no less. He spent Freedom Summer in Mississippi, and then he went into government. He served in the Massachusetts House of Representatives before going to Congress, but those are not the only elections he won. It will not surprise you to know that several times during his time on Capitol Hill, congressional staffers, who are a tough bunch because they've seen it all, voted him as the brainiest, the funniest, the most eloquent, and the hardest working member of Congress. His work on civil rights, on everyone's civil rights, has been formidable. And at the height of the recent Depression, he chaired the House Financial Services Committee and made his presence felt. His name is one half, the House of Representatives half, of the Dodd-Frank political reform measure, about which I'm sure we'll be talking more. Before the 2012 elections, he said enough. He left Congress, wrote the book we're talking about tonight, and is here to talk more about politics and political culture, and we hope himself. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Pat.
Do you miss it?
No, I enjoyed it greatly. I'm very happy that I had the chance to do it, but I was tired. It's not, I started working full-time in government in 1967 as an aide to the mayor of Boston in his campaign, and with a 6-month hiatus, I did that for 45 years, and I was just worn out. I was emotionally and physically exhausted. At first, I thought I wanted to run again, and then I realized, no, I just wanted some peace.
When you were young, probably the age other people were watching Howdy Doody, you were watching the Army McCarthy hearings, and this shaped your political...
Well, I watched Howdy Doody. I can sing the jingle, it's Howdy Doody time.
Did that prepare you well?
I remember Princess Summer, Fall, Winter, Spring, and Mr. Bluster. But I also was interested in the political side. There were 2 aspects of it. First, again, when I was 14, I read about Emmett Till, who was coincidentally a 14-year-old, a young a teenager from Chicago, who'd gone to Mississippi and was brutally beaten to death by white racists who included the sheriff of the county because they didn't like the way he looked at a white woman. And I was outraged, not just that he'd been beaten to death, but to realize that nobody was going to do anything, and that Southern filibustering had kept the federal government out of it. So I had this view that, yeah, I think the government should be active in doing this. At the same time, we had Senator Joseph McCarthy, one of the worst demagogues, a destroyer of people's reputations, a vicious bully, and he was being held in check, exposed, and ultimately dethroned by congressional hearings, by Senate hearings. And for me, that meant not just that I contrasted here was the Till case, nobody was doing anything, but here was the Army McCarthy hearings, where through this hearing process, they were exposing this guy for the bum that he was and refuting him. And I knew I was good at arguing. I had been told that I was good at arguing, including by some teachers who said, stop arguing. So those two events made me realize there was a need to make some improvements in society, but also that there was a way to do it that I was good at, that I could be good at those hearings, that was one of the talents I have. Obviously, we're all a mix of talents and weaknesses. That one played to my strengths.
And there's a performance quality to politics, which this, of course,
Oh, no question. I used to talk about that with Sonny Bono. Sonny got elected to Congress.
This is when Republicans and Democrats were friends.
Sonny got elected to Congress, as people know, and I think it was 92, or was it 94? But it was, and they have these events in Washington where the press invites members of Congress to be funny, knowing that most won't be, and it gives the press a chance to feel superior to members of Congress, which they very much enjoy. But they couldn't avoid asking Sonny, who was, of course, very funny and very flattering to me. He talked about what he learned, and he talked about my techniques, and in a very flattering way said he saw the way I used the rules, etc. So we became great friends. And as a matter of fact, at one point, Sonny came to me and said he needed a big favor. When he broke up with Cher, people thought he was through, that Cher had been carrying him. And what saved his career was when John Waters cast him in Hairspray. So Sonny was always very grateful to John Waters. And after I had come out and was publicly gay and was in a relationship, John Waters apparently asked Sonny if he could meet me. So Sonny and his then wife Mary, who survived him, and myself and the man I was dating at the time, had dinner with John Waters. So yeah, we had a great friendship with Sonny.
Where did that bipartisan amity go?
The Tea Party stole it. The fact is, and people should understand this, bipartisanship was alive and well in Congress through 2008, the end of 2008. By the way, bipartisanship is the flip side of the coin. Partisanship is a good thing. You do not have good democratic self-government without people dividing themselves in general according to what they believe. If you don't have parties, then it's just a sea of personality. The problem is not with partisanship, but with partisanship carried to excess, where you don't try to compromise and where you actively want to destroy things. But look at 2008. In January of 2008, George Bush said to the Democratic leadership, Nancy Pelosi and Harry Reid, the economy is hurting, I need a stimulus. And here's the deal, the difference between the Democrats and the Republicans they now are. When there's a Democratic president, a Republican president, the Democrats have conflicting impulses. Sure, he's a Republican and we don't want him to prosper, so we don't mind if he gets roughed up a little. But on the other hand, we believe in government. We're all of us in there because we want to use government, this wonderful instrument done right, to help people's lives. So when a president comes to us and says, the economy will be hurting if you don't work with me, we work with him because our commitment to helping people is more important than trying to defeat him. So Pelosi and Reid gave Bush a stimulus. A year later, when Obama takes office and has a worse economy because he inherited it, because of the deregulatory policies of the previous years, and he says, I need a stimulus, the Republicans almost unanimously say no. And here's the problem. When the Democrat is president, the way the Tea Party now is, they have an incentive to hurt him because he's a partisan, but they don't have the offsetting incentive to help government work, because what's happened is a group of people now in power who don't want the government to work. I have a little aside I have to explain to people. When I say that President Obama wanted a stimulus, and we did pass one, and almost all economists agree that it kept the recession from being worse. We want it to be bigger, but it clearly helped. But you won't see reference to it. In fact, you'll see signs that talk about the recovery bill. And the reason is that my Democratic colleagues, I am very supportive of them, but they're a little too fond of focus groups. Focus groups are when you get a group of people together who don't have strong opinions and ask them what they think about an issue. Now, the problem is that not having a strong opinion is kind of correlated with being an airhead. So you bring all these people together who don't know anything, and I'm very skeptical of what they tell you, but they, apparently after these focus groups, the Democratic leadership decided that we shouldn't call it a stimulus to help the economy, we should call it a recovery program. I told them that I thought that was counterintuitive because in my experience, people would rather be stimulated than recover. I don't know why recovery is better. But nonetheless, we did it. The other issue is this. 2008, George Bush sends his top economic people, Secretary of the Treasury, Chairman of the Fed. They come to Congress and say the economy is collapsing. It is falling apart. If you don't work with us on this program, it'll be destroyed. We say to ourselves, boy, we wish that wasn't the case. But the alternative is severe pain for the people we care about. Some have said to me, well, why were you worried about the banks? We were worried about the banks because if they collapsed, the economy would collapse. And I have to tell you, if we had not done something to prop up the financial system temporarily while we reformed it, the heads of Bank of America and Goldman Sachs and Morgan Stanley and J.P. Morgan Chase would not have been hurt. It would have been the average citizen who would have been hurt, so we had to do that. But the Democrats gave George Bush what he needed. Obama comes in, and Mitch McConnell says, my number one goal is to defeat him, and then it gets worse when the Tea Party comes in, and the problem is the Republican Party today is in the grips, particularly in the House, of people who do not understand the positive role of government and therefore have no incentive to cooperate.
Are you sure it is that they don't understand it, or they choose not to understand it?
Well, they ideologically reject it. That's a fair point. Some of it, it's kind of interesting because even many of them, if you say, well, what about this program and that program, they'll say, well, that's okay. But in general, many of them honestly believe that, well, there would be some harm if we withdrew almost every government intervention. And I mean, these are people who don't think there should be food stamps. They don't think there should be Medicaid. They are not in favor of aid to higher education to students. And that is the core that dominates the Republican Party in the House. They've gotten very extreme. The problem is, I think, is that I don't think they represent the average Republican, but they do represent the people who vote in primaries. And one of the great problems we have in America today is that the Republican primary voters are a very hard-right group. I mean, in what other normal context would Ted Cruz be a serious person? I mean, he's very smart, but he talks nonsense. But if you look at the self-selected group of Republican primary voters, he's plausible. I'll go back to 2012 with Newt Gingrich and Herman Cain, and now with Ben Carson. People who do not make much objective sense, but they appeal to the emotions of these people. Even if they don't ultimately win, they pull people to the right.
Your entry into public service was a consequence of a lot of the things that you felt and did growing up. Once you got in, first as a political aide and then in the Massachusetts State House, was what you could do very different from what you thought you could do?
No, I'm going to give myself a little credit. I followed politics very closely, and as a student first and as a sort of a volunteer. And I also had a pretty good understanding of who the voters were. I went to Harvard, but before that I'd worked at my father's truck stop, and I grew up in Bayonne, New Jersey. If you've seen On the Waterfront, that was a couple miles away in Hoboken, but that was the way I worked. So I always had a kind of dual approach, which is, one, it's very important to stand for things, but two, what good is standing for things if you don't accomplish anything? So I always had that kind of dual approach.
You mentioned Harvard, and I had mentioned Kissinger. What went through your mind sitting in Henry Kissinger's class at Harvard?
Well, remember, when I was, maybe I'm older than I look, but when I was taking a course from Henry Kissinger, it was 1962. Henry Kissinger wasn't Henry Kissinger yet. I mean, that was, he was an academic, so his later reputation had not arisen. I do, one great story I like about Kissinger, maybe it applies to me too. Someone once asked his older brother, they both came over from Germany, and someone said to his older brother, we're puzzled. You're older than Henry, so you were presumably more set in your ways when you got here, but you have much less of an accent than he does. How come Henry has a stronger accent? He said, that's because I listen to people.
You were speaking of the Tea Party, but in your book you made the point that not all Democrats shared your passion for advancing the liberal agenda. Why is the Democratic family split? What splits it?
Well, it's much less split than it used to be. There was a terrible split that grew up over the Vietnam War. And that was exacerbated by a difference in the cultures. the Democratic Party was a coalition that held together under, say, Franklin Roosevelt, Harry Truman, and into John Kennedy, of a lot of liberal intellectuals and then working people who had this kind of common interest. And I am critical of many of those who were my kind of socioeconomic peers by this time, people, students and others who kind of work with their heads more than their hands in terms of the jobs, because they allowed their anger over the Vietnam War to cloud their judgment. They expressed themselves in very angry ways. I think they created a split based on not just working class Americans saying, oh, these people are unpatriotic. You know, it's one thing to say you're against the Vietnam War. It's another thing to be seen to be rooting for people who are shooting American soldiers. And the anger, the attacks on the police, the vulgarity, it just drove people away. And I said to people, look, you have a right to say some of these things, but it goes back to your previous question, Pat. If you have a set of political goals that you want to accomplish, why do you then think you can disregard the effect your actions are going to have on persuading people? I mean, the more you care about a goal, the more you want to be willing to tailor your actions to deal with it. By now, I think that the Republican Party is much more split than the Democratic Party. I think you have a great deal of unity now in the Democratic Party. There was some problems early on in the Clinton administration over the issue of international trade, where many of us believe that international trade does advance the country as a whole economically, but it does so in ways that have an unfair effect from the standpoint within the country. I think there's now a broad recognition that inequality has expanded in an unhealthy way more than is required in a capitalist society, and that's both an economic problem because people don't have enough money to buy things, you've got drag in the economy, but also a serious social problem. I also believe it's related to the fact, not that we have a split in the Democratic Party, but that there was a segment of people who used to vote Democratic, mostly white working class men, who don't vote for us anymore. And it's not because they don't believe in government. They, I think government is very powerful, and they are angry because their economic position has clearly eroded over the years, and the government hasn't done anything to help them. The frustration for me is that many of us on the Democratic side have tried to help them. We are blocked by some of these right-wingers who the people we're trying to help then get angry at us and vote for them.
Unpack a little bit the antipathy that we see that translates into indifference on the part of voters, hostility toward the government, a sense of futility that the vote isn't going to matter. On the left, you may see it rising out of some of that anger. On the right, you may see the Tea Party hostility, although that's probably more active than others. But where does it come from?
No, you make a very good distinction there. Here's the problem. There is anger on the left and anger on the right. And here's my political, this is what bothers me politically. When the people on the right get angry, they vote. When people on the left get angry, they march. Voting beats marching. The Tea Party has had way more impact than Occupy. I didn't agree with everything Occupy said, but I certainly preferred them to the Tea Party. But they dissipated all their energy by almost refusing to participate. I asked one woman, I was on the Bill Maher show, which I'll be on again tomorrow night, give him a little plug, and it was a woman from Occupy, and I said, one of the things that bothered me was I've never seen a voting registration table at an Occupy site. She said, well, that's not what we're into. Well, that's part of the problem. I mean, the right is more likely to say, we have a good system here in America, we're patriotic, the wrong people are running that system, let's replace them. People on the left have been more inclined to say, oh, the system is no good. And yes, you're right about, look, we have two forms of voter suppression in the country. We have despicable legal voter suppression by the right, these laws that make it hard for people to vote, that say you have to have this certificate and that certificate. One of the members of the Congressional Black Caucus said to me, hey, my mother doesn't have a birth certificate because she was born in Mississippi in 1919. They didn't give black women birth certificates in Mississippi in 1919, so they make it harder for people. And that's awful. And there's, of course, right-wing Supreme Court with Justice Kennedy having occasional flashes of niceness, but not enough. But we also have voter suppression on the left. That's not legal, it's intellectual. If you tell people that all politicians are bums, that only money counts, that they don't pay any attention to your vote, you depress the turnout. And I would rather have them listen to Elizabeth Warren, who the day the committee I chaired passed the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau bill that she had advocated for us. And she was there at the meeting. And after the meeting was over, we had an informal conversation with the press, and she said very passionately, simple eloquence, they told me not even to try this because the banks always win, but they didn't win today. And that's because as a result of the financial crisis, people got motivated and they got active. Let me give you another example. People think, oh, the big money always wins. It's relevant to what's going on out here. Net neutrality. The big money was against net neutrality. The big money in the communication industry wanted to be able to charge more, et cetera. They got creamed politically because everybody with a computer went to defend his right. In my judgment, they were trying to defend the right to take advantage of other people's work without paying for it. I'm not too crazy about that. I'm on the content side. But they won overwhelmingly. So, again, I think that the right gets mad and they participate more. And the left gets mad and they go and have marches. And that's a lot of what I talk about in the book. It doesn't work.
A lot of voters, though, see very little difference. They're not looking at policy. They're seeing vested interests and political figures who are interested in keeping themselves in office more than anything else, according to voters.
What's that? Yeah, I mean, most people who are running would like to be reelected. That's a human instinct. But the notion that there aren't differences, look what's going to be at issue in the 2016 election. Climate change.
Benghazi.
What?
No Benghazi?
No, that's not going to be an issue. Benghazi's over. I mean, what's going to be decided by the 2016 election? What public policies will be affected? If you think that we should simply ignore climate change, then you vote Republican. Because if the Republicans win, that will be the effective end of any effort to deal with climate change. If you think that we have overregulated the bankers and the securities industry and the derivatives people, and we should go back to where we were before 2009 and 10, with mortgages freely given to people who couldn't repay them, and then those being packaged into securities that people bought and couldn't pay off. If the Republicans win in 2016, financial reform will be substantially abolished. You can go all down the line. The issue differences between the two parties have never been greater. And people who say, oh, there's no difference, or there's too much fighting, that seems to me sensible. Only again, if you don't care about climate change, you don't care about financial reform, you want to see health care rolled back, you're not interested in protecting, which I think is a very important thing from the standpoint of equality, the rights of working men and women to join unions, those are all going to be on the table next year.
I wouldn't be surprised if there's some in the audience who are anxious to wear Elizabeth Warren for president buttons. What about that?
Well, let me say first, I am a great friend of Elizabeth Warren. I'm very proud that she's one of the people who says nice things about my book. Even more than that, if you read Elizabeth's book, she says very nice things about our work.
There it is.
We worked together on the financial reform bill. She says nice things about me. She also talks about the time she came to my apartment in Newton to discuss this. And because I was late, she spent some time talking to the person she describes as, quote, his handsome surfer dude boyfriend, who's here in the audience, now my husband, I'm very pleased to say. And and I admire Elizabeth a lot. I don't understand why other people who admire her don't believe her when she said she's not running for president. She's smart not to run for president. In the first place, she is now one of the most powerful forces trying to reverse the bad trends in America. I am much less worried that there will be erosion of the financial reform bill that I worked on before the election. The election could change it all. But I don't think there'll be any erosion between now and then, or if a Democrat is reelected, because she is such a powerful and eloquent and respected defender of it, and she's been doing that. If she were to run for president in the first place, she would lose the ability she has to say, meet me on the merits, debate me on the merits. The media would start picking at her, oh, she's just saying that to run for president. Secondly, I do not believe there are very substantial differences between her and Hillary Clinton. you go back to Paul Krugman, the great liberal economist, one of the great voices for sanity in America today. During the 2008 election, he kept pointing out that Hillary Clinton was to Barack Obama's left on domestic issues. Now, I regretted that she was for the war in Iraq. So was John Kerry. So a lot of the people, I think they have learned from that. But there is no great gulf. When the Congress passed and the president signed a bill I wish he hadn't signed that included a weakening of the financial reform bill to get an appropriations passed, Hillary Clinton tweeted against it. And I'll tell you, this notion that people don't like Hillary Clinton, if you look at the whole set of policies she has, I would think most liberals would be very happy at the idea of there being there. But there is this, and it's a personal thing, and I have to say it, those of us who are on the liberal side, a part of us is to think of ourselves as insurgents. We are not entirely comfortable being in the majority. If we are in the majority, we think maybe we haven't asked for enough, that we need to be the kind of the yeast in the body politic, and to be pushing for more. And the notion that you have someone with a very liberal record in Hillary Clinton, who appears to be pretty electable, makes people uneasy. I can't believe it. And then this notion, oh no, a primary is good for you. Well, first of all, let me say, as someone who's been there, I don't know anybody who's ever been in a primary who likes them. But beyond that, if you think the Democrats would benefit from a vigorous, ideologically charged debate, tell me how you think that helped Mitt Romney in 2012. I don't see why we Democrats should reproduce what happened to Mitt Romney in 2012.
You were the first member of Congress to voluntarily come out
Yes.
as gay. As we know from your book, this was something that, of course, had been on your mind since you went into public service. What would happen, when it would happen, how it would happen. So talk about how it happened and then the consequences to you as a policymaker and with your colleagues.
Well, okay, let me start with that. That's a great question. And let me start with the last part. Very little happened. It had no negative effect on my ability to influence public policy, which came as a great pleasant surprise to me. In fact, it may have enhanced my influence some, because many of my colleagues, before I actually acknowledged when the Boston Globe asked me that I was gay, a number of very good liberals came to me in the House, people who were certainly as pro-LGBT as you could be, and they said, well, here you're going to come out, please don't do it. And their view was that if I were to acknowledge being gay, it would diminish my influence on almost every other issue, that I would be seen sort of as a one-issue candidate, that I wouldn't be as effective in affordable housing or the environmental issues or cutting military spending or expanding health care or other things they cared about. And my answer to them was, look, I can't tell you you're wrong. I hope you're wrong. I don't know that. But I can't live this way anymore. I mean, I'll get to that. And then after I came out, a couple months later, a number of them came to me and said, good thing. You're easier to work with now. Legislating is the most personal of businesses. Everybody is everybody else's equal. I mean, being influential in the legislature has something in common with being popular in high school. I'm serious about that. And they said, we're glad you came out because you're easy to work with. And that continued even under periods of stress. Jim is here, and he told me one day, he was in Washington, I would ask him to come down in the midst of all that terrible turmoil, which was very important to me to have him there as a guide and a source of strength and support. And one day he said he'd met the senior Republican on the committee that I chaired. And he'd gotten to know him well. He got to know the other members. And he said, he ran into Jim in the hallway. He said, I knew you were in town. Jim said, how'd you know? He said, Barney was nice to me today. So that was, but how I came out, I decided, look, I said when I was 14 that I wanted to be in politics. I knew that, but I was gay. And that wouldn't work. So I decided I would simply repress being gay. I would sacrifice personal life to career. And I did that for a while, and it was untenable. There are people who say, oh, she doesn't need a career, and she doesn't need a personal life, she has a career. I have not found that to be true in any human being. We all have needs, emotional needs, physical needs, that are not going to get satisfied by a career. And in fact, I found as my career went on, as I became, frankly, better known, more popular, the contrast between an increasingly rewarding public life and a miserable, self-repressed private life became very tough. I'd go to these meetings, including with gay people, because I one of the things I decided when I ran finally was I could not be honest about being gay, but I would never be a hypocrite and withhold support. So from the first year of my elected office, I was the leading advocate for gay rights. It was unthinkable that I would do anything less than be supportive. So I would go to these meetings with gay people, and we would be cheering our progress, and everybody would be happy, and everybody would be clapping for me, and I go home alone. And that just began to wear on me and affect me. So I then decided in the late 70s, all right, I can't do this anymore. I probably can't survive politically if I come out or get to a higher job. So I'll finish about 10 years in the state legislature. I'd gone to law school. I'll be an openly gay lawyer who used to be a state legislator, which will make me fairly high up in the ranks of gay people who had public office, and be a gay rights advocate and lawyer. And I was in the process of doing that when Pope John Paul II intervened. Yes. I lived in the district of Tip O'Neill. And, well, it was more like if not a canonization, a beatification of me. I'll explain that. I lived in the district of Tip O'Neill, a great man. I was very happy he was there. So I couldn't run for Congress while he was there. But the district next to me was represented by a very liberal Jesuit priest, Robert Drinan, been a leading anti-war guy, been the dean of Boston College Law School. And when John Paul II became Pope, American conservatives said to him, you got this big liberal there, you got to get rid of. By the way, you should know that LA probably played a part in that. Everything I have heard makes me believe that Robert Dornan, LA's contribution to...
Orange County, please.
Yes, I'm sorry, Orange County. Well, but he ran, I guess, he moved down, but you know who he originally beat to run for Congress? Gregory Peck's son. He beat Kerry Peck. He was, of course, the Tin Man's nephew, Jack Haley. So the Tin Man's nephew beat Gregory Peck's son in a classic
All of
West
our
Coast
elections
battle.
are like that.
That's right. But he went to the Pope, among others, and said, this man, he retards our ability. So the Pope ordered Drinan not to run again. And when the Pope ordered Drinan not to run again, on 2 days' notice, I moved into that district and ran. So if it had not been for the Pope, I would not ever have been a congressman. And Father Drinan said he had one great regret in his life, which was that he never got to stay to the Pope, because they wouldn't have him near the Pope. That business with my congressional seat, did that work out the way you expected it to? Because he got me. But anyway, so I went back in the closet. I went to Washington, and I said, all right, here's the deal. Now I'm in Washington. I'm a little bit away from home. I got a little privacy here. I'm going to not come out publicly, but privately I'll socialize with other gay people and live as a gay man. That didn't work either. I was too prominent. I needed secrecy, not privacy, given my, I was a fairly prominent congressman. And it made me do things that were stupid. And finally I said, no, I'm not going to live like this anymore. And I then decided, okay, I have sacrificed my personal life to my career. I think I can now have both, because this is by the mid-'80s. And I was also sufficiently popular in my district. I was running unopposed, in 1984 and 86, virtually. So I figured, even if I lose some votes, I'll still survive, and I may not lose as many. But I also said, and I said this to my colleagues who didn't want me to come out, lest I have a diminished influence, I can't do this anymore. I cannot live so angry. And you know the worst kind of anger is when you're angry at yourself. If you can be angry at somebody else, that's got at least some cathartic effect. But when you're angry at yourself, you have nowhere to go with that anger, and it eats you. And so I decided I was going to come out. But here was the problem. Well, in the first place, as some of you may have heard, there was a right-wing gay man who used to vote anti-gay named Robert Bauman from Maryland. And he got caught because he picked up a teenager at a gay strip club, and the teenager's boyfriend was angry, and he copied down his license plate and reported him to the police, and the kid was underage. So he was arrested, and he got Congress. He then became very angry because he had been outed and defeated. But he was defeated because he was a hypocrite, not because he was gay. But he thought I was getting away with too much, and I wasn't out. So he wrote a book that kind of hinted that I was gay. Well, I didn't want to surprise people. I didn't know what the press was going to do. So I went to Tip O'Neill and said, I just want to tell you something. A book's going to come out that's going to hint that I'm gay. And he was a wonderful man. He said, oh, Barney, don't pay any attention to that bleep. They're always spreading those stories about us. I said, yeah, well, this one's true, so that makes it a little bit different. He was very kind. he was sad, he said, and he thought I had a great career. Maybe I'd be a speaker. He actually said, I thought you might be the first Jewish speaker. And at any rate, that fizzled, and here's why it fizzled, and this is the next step of my coming out. The media then and now has this rule that they will not tell the public that a prominent figure, a politician, an athlete, an entertainer, is gay or lesbian unless that individual volunteers it. I used to think that was a good protection of our privacy. It now troubles me because they'll tell you almost anything else about somebody. So what's the justification for this? It can only be that being gay or lesbian is so terrible that it's kind of a nuclear weapon to use against people. But here was the other problem. If you were involved in some unpleasantness, or if you were very sick and your sexual orientation was relevant to that, then they would mention it. So during the 80s, the only prominent people who were known to be gay or lesbian were people who had AIDS, were people involved in some scandal. And I said, no, I want to be one who comes out without that. But I had this problem because the press said, oh, you have to tell us, we can't ask you. I said at the time, this is reflective of my nervousness about this, well, I'm not going to volunteer it. I was ready to come out and be honest about who I was and live a better life, but I still was afraid of its political impact, so I decided on my minimization strategy. Basically what I said was, okay, I'm going to come out, but I'm going to tell people it's not a big deal. After all, I'm still me. That was our strategy back then. So what, I'm gay, etc. Don't make it a big deal. Aside, if your sexuality is not a big deal, you have my sympathy. I mean, it's part of a healthy life. But that's what I want to do. So I told the Boston Globe, which was interested in this. They heard that I was thinking about it. I said, I'm ready to come out. They said, okay, give us your statement. I said, no, I'm not going to volunteer it because here's the deal. I was ready to say it was not a big deal. Well, if I announced it, how do I say it's not a big deal? I say to people, that's not a big deal. Well, why'd you tell us it? Why'd you have a press conference? So I needed to be asked. But the Boston Globe didn't want to ask me because that would violate the rule. Finally, they became so nervous, as you would understand, Pat, that they would be scooped by somebody else in their area of prime jurisdiction, that they did ask me. I gave my very considered answer, yes, so what? And that's how it happened.
What about money in politics, which seems to have turned off so many voters, and of course with Citizens United?
Yep.
You mentioned Justice Kennedy, and I think it was Justice Scalia who said that sunshine will solve everything and expose the money for what it is.
Scalia is too smart to believe that. I think that was cynicism on his part. It's awful. This notion that you cannot have democracy without the unrestricted flow of campaign money, if that is true, by the way, there has been only one democracy in the history of the world. It's been America in the last 20 years. Because no other democracy, not England, not France, not Israel, has ever allowed the unrestricted flow of money. It's always been considered to be separate. And even in America, until recently, John McCain used to, the big campaign financial restriction bill was McCain-Feingold. This is a terrible idea. And let me give you the philosophical basis for it. We have two systems in this country. We have a private economic system, capitalism, where we generate the wealth. And then we have a public system, which is governed by the principle of one person, one vote. Now, in the private sector, money gives you more influence, and that's the way it is. If you're going to have a capitalist system, people with more money are going to have more influence. That's how capitalism works. Then you have the political system, one person, one vote. What the U.S. Supreme Court did was to take down the wall so that money now has disproportionate influence and outweighs the one person, one vote system. It's a disaster. But then what do you do about it? You don't defeat that. I got to say that I talked about some of the liberal responses that trouble me. There's one in particular that is much too often our main response and is very unhelpful, fetching. There is nothing to be gained by complaining and whining and moaning and poor me and, oh, isn't this terrible? What are we going to do about it? Well, in the first place, it's one more issue I should have mentioned in the 2016 election. If a Democrat is elected president, probably Hillary Clinton, there are likely to be some vacancies on the Supreme Court, and I believe she would appoint someone if one of the justices who voted for Citizens United retired, she would appoint someone to overturn it. And here's why. Ordinarily, we have this system in the Supreme Court called stare decisis, let the decision stand in Latin, where once a decision has been made, you abide by it, because you can't keep changing all the time. But a 5-4 decision that was so controversial has no binding precedential weight. There would be nothing to stop a new 5-person majority from overturning that. It wouldn't be that there were vested interests that would be overturned. So the way to overturn Citizens United is to elect a Democrat who will appoint somebody. In the interim, the answer is, one, give money. We aren't going to match them dollar for dollar, but you get a certain order of magnitude, it's helpful. And the other is votes. Money is very influential, but money does best in a vacuum. And votes can sometimes win. We have no option. So yes, first of all, remember, when people complain, and let me add to this, financial reform, climate change, money in politics, all issues that are at stake. I would throw in abortion, because it is also clear that if Republicans elected president and the two Democrats who are older, Steve Breyer and Ruth Ginsburg, if they leave the court, then that'll be the end of the right of women to choose. That majority will tip. So, but that's the answer to Citizens United.
What do you think of the blueprint of government? Is there something that needs to change in Congress, or is it the congressmen and congresswomen who need?
It's the latter. Look, it worked fine through 2008. Go back. Bill Clinton, they tried to impeach him, but things got done. We raised taxes on the wealthy. Sorry to some of you out there, but you didn't get hurt. We did okay. You didn't miss it. And now I'm making that money too, so it was me too. We get along. And then George Bush comes in, and he works with some Democrats. He passes No Child Left Behind, which I don't like. I voted against it. But Ted Kennedy was his big collaborator. And so you didn't start hearing this business about total partisan gridlock until 2011. I mean, literally, it's when the right-wing Republicans took over. So that's not systemic. Now, what happened was people got very angry. It's very frustrating to me. Republican deregulatory policies caused the crash. We then come in and have the responsibility of cleaning it up, and we get blamed for it. Let me give you an example. You'll hear people complain about the Democrats and the bailouts. There were 5 bailouts during that period. Bear Stearns, AIG, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, the TARP program for the banks, and the auto industry. Every one of the 5 was initiated by George W. Bush. 2 of them he not only initiated, but did all by himself. 3 we Democrats in Congress helped carry it out, changing it in the case of the auto industries to make it a better program. So people got so angry because of what we had to do to fix this. I understand that the TARP looked bad to people. The banks screwed up, so what do we do when we got money to the banks? The reason we got money to the banks is very simple. Our economy depended very much on people lending each other money. If people stopped lending each other money, things would grind to a halt. The banks actually paid us back with some interest, but the more important point was this. As I said before, if the banks stopped functioning, the top bankers with all their money would have been fine. It would have been the working class people who couldn't get their paychecks cashed, and that would have ground down. But people got angry at that, and so they blamed us for that, and that's why you got this white heat anger on the part of the Tea Party, plus some notion that it wasn't legitimate to have Obama. But look, there are people who think no Democratic president is legitimate. Remember, they tried to impeach Bill Clinton, throw him out of office despite 2 re-elections. But it is entirely a function of these right-wing Republicans taking over and rejecting the notion that government has a positive role, and therefore you sometimes compromise the interest of keeping government going.
How do you assess President Obama's performance, and to what extent that you just alluded to, the criticism of him is racially generated?
Some of it's racially generated. Look, just compare him and Ted Cruz.
The Canadian senator?
Ted Cruz was actually born outside America. Barack Obama was born inside America. In both cases, by the way, the determinant is your mother's birth. So in neither case is there legitimate, even if Obama had been born somewhere else, which he was born in Hawaii. So how can people? It's Kenya. You know what organization started in Kenya?
Acorn?
The Mau Mau. Oh, historically, the Mau Mau. The Mau Mau was a Kenyan organization. You read Something of Value by Robert Work. So there's clearly a racial element in it. There's no question. Beyond that, I evaluate him very highly. Look, here's one of the things people don't understand. They say, why haven't you Democrats done more? Anybody want to guess for how many years, beginning with Ronald Reagan's presidency, 35 years, in the past 35 years, in how many of those years was there a Democratic president, House, and Senate?
2.
4. The first 2 of Clinton, the first 2 of Obama. We're getting held accountable for 31 years when we didn't have the power to deliver. I get blamed. I'm very glad to rest of the book. Well, what about Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac and the low-cost loans? From 1995 through 2006, the Republicans controlled Congress. The liberals tried to stop the predatory loans. I document that, and there's appendices in the book. When we try to stop banks from lending money to poor people they shouldn't have, the Wall Street Journal attacked us, said we were undermining capitalism. What you get is Judge Obama, certainly the first 2 years. The first 2 years under President Obama were among the best, in my judgment, public policy in American history. Financial reform, equal to what Franklin Roosevelt did, and it will, if it's allowed to survive. Healthcare, the biggest expansion of healthcare since 1965 in Medicare for people who didn't need it, and also helping others in the society. The Lilly Ledbetter Act, which enhanced the ability of women to sue if they were being discriminated against.
It was the first bill he signed.
Yes. The law, the Supreme Court decided that if you were a woman and you found out after 8 years that you had been being paid less than a guy doing the same job, too bad, because you had to have sued 7 years ago when you didn't know it. You had to have sued before you knew it. We repealed Don't Ask, Don't Tell, a 20-year disgrace. We passed a little-known bill, doesn't do as much as it did, but we cracked down on a lot of this overseas tax funny business. He was great on LGBT rights. And when Barack Obama, he took the most extraordinary step on behalf of LGBT equality that a president could do. He refused to defend a statute in the Supreme Court, the Defense of Marriage Act. That was an extraordinary statement that says, boy, it is my job to uphold the laws, and I uphold the laws, and this stinks so bad, I got to make an exception. That had a very powerful message, ultimately approved by people. His Supreme Court appointments were great. On foreign policy, he's been good. I wish he was better. He's getting this pressure to go back in. I think withdrawing from Iraq made perfect sense. I think withdrawing from Afghanistan does. We have a wonderful military, and they are very good at stopping bad things from happening. But no military can go into a country that is internally riven, where there are religious disputes and there are corruption problems and no respect for democratic processes. And by our weaponry, change that. We went into Afghanistan to get rid of Osama bin Laden, which we did. By the way, the notion that we cannot live with a Taliban-ruled Afghanistan, George Bush could. When George Bush became president, the Taliban ruled Afghanistan. He made no move against them until they harbored that mass murderer of bin Laden. If they had said, okay, you can come get bin Laden, here he is, we never would have invaded Afghanistan. So I think even in foreign policy, I wish he'd moved further. I understand the pressures. He's moved, it seems to me, in the right direction. So yeah, I give him overall very high marks.
And what about the relationship with Israel, which I know will come up in questions?
That is tough, and I have to say, I with regard to Prime Minister Netanyahu, people said, what did you think about his speech? And here's what I've said. If I'd been there, I wouldn't have been there. And I thought it was very important and still important for us to make a distinction, many of us, between Prime Minister Netanyahu and the State of Israel. It is legitimate to be critical of him, but you don't let that spill over into the state. I was angry at him. I have to say I was influenced by the article, and I think today's New York Times, that said even some of Netanyahu's critics in Israel think the president may be generating some sort of a backlash there. So it may be that, I guess, they have to do a better job of separating their unhappiness with Netanyahu from Israel policies. I think it's a great mistake to suggest that we would allow a resolution to go through in the UN. That's a great mistake. So I do think that the Prime Minister made a terrible mistake when he said he was not for a Palestinian state, and here's the reason. I believe over the years, it has been more the fault of the Palestinians than anybody else that we didn't have a two-state solution. Bill Clinton tried to do that in the Wye River. Ehud Barak, a Labor prime minister, tried. Ehud Olmert tried. Tzipi Livni, who was one of the leaders in the, from my standpoint, unfortunately unsuccessful opposition. There was a very good article by Roger Cohen in the New York Times in which he talks about the times when the Arabs didn't step up. And I think the problem was that you did not have on the Palestinian side a willingness to confront their own extremists and accept a pretty good deal. They could have had a two-state solution. And I think it's important that Israel always be clearly trying to achieve peace, understanding that it may not be their fault. But what Netanyahu did was to let them off the hook. From now on, no matter what kind of a reasonable offer anybody made and you don't get it, a lot of people are going to blame Israel, maybe unfairly, because of what he said. I do not understand, I guess, for electoral purposes, but there ought to be a limit on the extent to which you undermine your country's best interest. So he now understands that, and he's trying to walk back from it. Well, that's not easily done. And I think that he did make that terrible mistake. And I would hope that they would say, look, of course we're not going to support a one-sided Palestinian resolution, especially if people said their resolution doesn't, it's not a two-state solution, it's a one-state solution. They forget about having a democratic Israel, a Jewish state that's democratic. And that, of course, you hear, oh no, why does it have to be we're not in favor of a Jewish democratic state, we want a secular state. Saudi Arabia is all of a sudden against religious states? Nonsense. But I think he's played the card very badly. We should, I guess, a little too long, let me just say this. What I would focus on is this, to say, look, here's the deal. Stop settlements for a while. They're not in Israel's interest. They undercut your argument. And sure, we'll veto these things. Stop the settlements and get us back on track.
We'll go to questions in just a second. Before we do, I have one more question for you, which is, why do the Republicans seem better at messaging than Democrats?
Because they tell people the easy thing. Ronald Reagan told people that he could cut taxes and they wouldn't miss any of the programs. And that's what I do think, that they give people, or they say now that you can cut taxes and don't worry because we'll have more revenue in the end. Supply side economics. I was at the Financial Services Committee when somebody asked Alan Greenspan, certainly a very distinguished conservative, a Republican, said, Mr. Chairman of the Federal Reserve, isn't it true that if we cut taxes, in the end we'll have more money? He said, Congressman, that theoretically could be true, but in fact it has never happened in my lifetime. Now, I think some of I would say, though, is that they're not better at messaging. I think they have messed up the immigration issue. They have made themselves look very bigoted. On LGBT rights, they're suffering from cultural lag. You know, they were objecting to our rights long after the public changed. But on the general government principle, they, as I said, tell people an easy and untrue message. Look, here is I just was on with somebody who said, yeah, the polls show the people want to pay less taxes and they want more programs. I once was talking to a Boston city councilor named Freddie Langone in 1969. He and his brother Joe ran the funeral home in the north end of Boston. And the people in one neighborhood wanted a swimming pool. So the mayor agreed to build a swimming pool. I was working for the mayor. The next thing we know, we're getting complaints. There's noise. The trucks are coming in with stuff. I said, well, we're building a swimming pool. What do you expect? I said to Fred, Freddie, I was 28. I said, I don't understand. First, people insist that we build the swimming pool. Now they're complaining because of the noise instead of a swimming pool. He looked at me very pityingly. He said, hey, kid, ain't you heard the news? Everybody wants to go to heaven, but nobody wants to die. And that's, people want this, but they don't want to go through it. Well, that's the fundamental advantage the Republicans have by telling people that they can cut taxes but have a better VA and not lose any Social Security, et cetera, et cetera. That can be a hard thing to counter. And I have to say, yes, let me close with this because there may be a theme here. Things are not going to get better. And there is, the people are unhappy about this, the people are unhappy about that. Well, you know what? Look, the media sometimes drives me crazy. And the politicians, I have been very critical of my fellow politicians, but if you look at the way they have behaved, the voters are no bargain either. Nobody's in the House of Representatives who didn't get sent there by more people than anybody else who voted in that election. So in the end, this isn't going to change until the people change it.
So let's take some questions from you. I will call upon you individually if you'll stand and speak your question, and then my alter ego in the audience, Kevin Lloyd. Where's Kevin? I want everybody to see.
Right here to help.
Oh, there he is. Then he will repeat it so we can hear you on the microphone. So let's see who we've got over here first. Somebody? No? Right here. Stand up, please. No, don't go to the microphone. Just go stand up and
Just say your question.
No, Kevin, we don't want to do that because we can't get to the people in there. So if you can get close enough to repeat his question.
Say your question, we'll repeat it if people can't hear it.
Kevin, go ahead.
Why would anyone enter politics today given the scrutiny?
Because if you, I guess I'm going to quote a great 20th century philosopher. Some audiences I'm more familiar with him than others. I look around this audience, this will be familiar. His name was Henny Youngman. The great king of the one-liners. And back then, 50s and 60s, the staple of humor was making fun of your wife, your mother-in-law. Men didn't want to get married, women did. But he had one two-line joke that was very profound. How's your wife? Compared to what? That's my mantra when I'm making decisions. It's always compared to what? If you have a desire to change society in certain ways, yeah, there are a lot of drawbacks to going into politics, but what's better? That's the answer.
Somebody over here? No?
Having
Okay,
said
hold
that,
on.
I should add that. I take
I
it
want to
back.
try to get to the back first. Okay, here and then there.
There is a drop-off. I don't mean to totally denigrate it. Clearly, we are paying a price because we have made it harder, not just for people to go into elected office. We suffer now because we treat any appointee as one step ahead of indictment. And you have a lot of very able people who will not take appointed positions in government to the society's unbenefit.
All right, I pointed to somebody there. All right,
All right, please.
let's,
All right, now,
We have
I
the
expected
question,
that.
Kevin, I think.
What you just heard was, which I anticipated, that I was allowing subprime lending to go forward. Let me read. You got the book. Go to the appendices. I expected this. Who did what on subprime lending? Subprimes. 1994, Democratic Congress passes it. Bill Clinton signs the Home Ownership and Equity Protection Act, directing the Federal Reserve to adopt rules to prevent irresponsible lending. 94 to 2006, Alan Greenspan, the Republican, refuses to enforce that law. 95 to 2006, members of the congressional minority, including me, tell Greenspan to act to stop subprime lending abuses. I don't know where you got this idea that I was in favor of subprime lending. The fact is that it just... No, let him talk. Excuse me. Where did you get the idea that I was for subprime lending? What's your basis for claiming that I was pushing subprime lending?
Rolling the dice, sir. You're on record.
Yes, I was talking about rolling the dice at Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac for affordable rental housing. Go look at the quote. I believe that instead of giving low-income people mortgages they couldn't pay, we should build good rental housing. That's what that refers to. Let me continue to read for you.
next question was here. Stand up, please.
In
Oh, wait a second, we have something else from the book.
2000
Thank
to
you.
2004, a lot of liberals got some states to stop subprime lending. The Bush administration used the federal power.
Please be quiet.
I'm sorry, what did you want to say?
He's answering your question. Please be
No,
quiet.
please. I don't like these kind of things to go unanswered. What's that? Please say what? Oh, no, this was in 2000 to 2004. I was there when states passed laws to stop it, and the federal government overturned them. Now, here's this. In 2004 and 2006, I and several other Democrats tried to pass a law to stop subprime lending, predatory, and the Republicans wouldn't stop it. In 2007 was the first time I was in the majority. I was in the minority till then. And I got a bill passed to deal with subprime lending. And here's what the Wall Street Journal said today about that in November. As early as today, Mr. Frank plans to hold a committee vote on his Mortgage Reform and Anti-Predatory Lending Act. For the first time, banks that securitize mortgages would be made liable for violations of the law. The Frank bill adds a new risk element, and it surely will. The main losers will be subprime borrowers who will not get loans. Mr. Frank's legislation, in the name of consumer protection, let me go back to this. Most of these new homeowners are low-income families, often minorities, who would otherwise not have qualified for a mortgage. In the name of consumer protection, Mr. Frank's legislation will ensure that these loans are not issued in the future. And you also see in here a quote from Sheila Bair, who was the Republican appointee. She was a Bob Dole Republican who became head of the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. I asked you to look at this in the book. You can go up in the index. And she notes that in 2004 and 5, I did try, as a member of the minority, to stop predatory lending, and the Republican leadership overruled me. The argument here is that somehow I was secretly controlling Tom DeLay, the Republican leader. And let me, one last sentence. Here's the deal. If I was in charge of the Republicans when they were in power and I was in the minority, we would not have gone to war in Iraq. We would not have cut taxes for rich people, and Tom DeLay would not have gone on Dancing with the Stars. I would have told him not to do that.
Next question here. Stand up. Kevin? Yes, sir.
I was first asked, my fellow was electable. Who would you pick?
Let me get Kevin to repeat that very quickly, just
I
the
can
last
do,
bit.
which of the
If you can
Republican
just wait 1
candidates?
second, please,
I can
Tom.
do it. Pat, what's your,
Did everybody hear it?
I was about to repeat the question. Go
All
ahead.
right.
He,
Go ahead.
he was just wondering if there was a Republican candidate similar to John Huntsman who kind of caught your eye, who could.
Fair enough.
Is there a Republican candidate today who stands a chance that I would like to, that I could support for president? The answer is no for this reason. It's the same reason John Huntsman had no chance. The Republican primary electorate has become such a right-wing group that no one who could win that nomination would pass it. Yes, there are some very good Republicans, but none of them could get the nomination or would even try. I mean, the notion about the Republican nomination today, I got to quote Marx.
Groucho.
And Groucho said he wouldn't want to be a member of any club that would accept someone like him. I mean, the fact is, so you're exactly right. John Huntsman, a reasonable, decent guy, had no chance. So nobody who would have a chance today, by definition, would be acceptable.
Over here in the front row, please.
Yes, Congressman.
Oh, good. We can.
The repeal of the Sago flame that started the 2008. Can you make a comment about that?
Yeah, the question was, did the repeal of Glass-Steagall start the problem? No, for two reasons. First of all, the problem started far before that. What happened was this. Many people here got a mortgage, however many years ago, and you borrowed money from the bank, and you had to pay that bank back. And then in the 80s, money came in from outside the banking system, long before Glass-Steagall, and information technology developed to the point where people could make loans, sell those loans, and package them into a security. Understand that that was entirely legal under Glass-Steagall. That went ahead because Glass-Steagall simply said you can be a bank or you can be an investment house. It did not regulate the kind of loans that were made. It also did not regulate the derivative trades because when Glass and Steagall never heard of, when Glass and Steagall were around, derivatives were pork bellies. They weren't these financial instruments. So I do not think it contributed. Elizabeth Warren, by the way, I'm not saying this in self-defense. I voted against that bill. But I didn't vote against it to keep Glass-Steagall because I thought it was outdated 80 years later. I voted against it because it did not contain new regulations to replace them. And even Elizabeth Warren, who would like to see Glass-Steagall to reduce the banks, acknowledged it had no role in the, it had no role with the, in the financial crisis because the bad loans that were being made, the subprime loans, they would have been perfectly legitimate, unfortunately, under Glass-Steagall.
Over here, a question? Yes, right there. Please stand up.
Well, what happened?
Maybe, can we
I'm
repeat
sorry,
that,
Kevin, yeah.
Kevin, quickly?
Yeah, he was wondering what happens behind closed doors in the House.
I appreciate
Apropos
it.
of Obama.
Unfortunately, the problem is this. one thing that's happened recently is, particularly with the Tea Party, there is much less cross-party conversation. One of the things that happened, by the way, this started not just with the Tea Party, but with Newt Gingrich. Newt Gingrich ran for Republican leader to overthrow a man named Bob Michael, who was a reasonable conservative from Illinois, because he said Michael's wrong. He says that the Democrats are reasonable people with whom he disagrees. They're not. They're corrupt. They're immoral, etc. One of the things that then happened was it became a bad thing to spend time in Washington. Very odd. People would run for Congress so they could not be there. And you had to show how much you had to go home. Not everybody did that. There were some weekends in the House gym when Henry Waxford and I were the only guys in town, because we both felt it was important to stay there and do the job. 30 years ago, members of Congress lived in Washington much of the time, and they had dinner together, and they socialized together, and their kids went to school together. What's happened now is, and this is directly to answer your question, there is no socializing, particularly across party lines. Members only meet each other in the arena, so you don't have those kind of personal relationships. And the answer is, unfortunately, that there is not conversation. We do have in the Democratic cloakroom, the cloakrooms are segregated by party. We lament this. I tried very hard to work with Republicans. By the time I became chairman, I had Republicans I wanted to work with. Well, let me give you the example. This had to do with the subprime lending situation. There was a Republican named Spencer Backus who was against the bad predatory loans. And we tried to work with him to put it together. And I got to read this is back to the other question. This is the part I was looking for. This is Sheila Bair. She was a Republican who was appointed by George W. Bush to head the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. In 2005, Congressman Barney Frank and Spencer Backus, Republican Alabama, tried to put together a bipartisan effort to establish national lending standards, that is, to ban subprime loans. This is 2005. However, the effort met stiff opposition from the industry, which complained to the Republican leadership. Backus was forced to stop negotiating with Frank under pressure from the House GOP leadership. So there's your answer, and that's what happened to Spencer Backus. Was a Republican from Alabama, a conservative guy, a little bit of a populist. Not only was he told that, but in 2007, when I became chairman, and we did pass that bill that the Wall Street Journal objected to, and he voted for it. A minority of Republicans voted for it. He was told, he was then the senior Republican on the committee, the minority leader. He was told by John Boehner that if he ever did that again, he would not be the leader anymore of the Republican Party, that he was not allowed to cooperate with me.
Let's make this our last question here.
Thank you so much. In response to that last, to kill off gays in the state of
Did everyone hear that? All right.
Yeah, I read about the, what was it called?
It's the Sodomite Suppression
The
Act.
Sodomy Suppression. I'll be honest with you, I thought that was the title of a bad porn movie. But, of course, the answer is that will go nowhere. It would be unconstitutional. We tried it. But there is, yes, there are people who are haters. And you have seen this. You've certainly seen it. Well, it's interesting. We have made much more progress, and I regret this, in dealing with the homophobia than with racism. Homophobia is on the ropes. Racism, sadly, is still around. And that was symbolized by 1 week. You know, you talk about the mixed emotions week. Back to the old Henny Youngman days. What's mixed emotions? Seeing your mother-in-law go over the cliff in your car. That was Henny Youngman. But in that same week, the U.S. Supreme Court in June of 2013 threw out the Defense of Marriage Act, a great advance for LGBT people, and also threw out the Voting Rights Act, a disgrace. What you saw people getting beaten badly in Selma to accomplish, which Congress then responded to, gets thrown out. So unfortunately, there is still, and I think you see this, by the way, finally, in some of the anti-immigrant rhetoric. That anti-immigrant rhetoric, you know, let me give you another example. Ebola. There was a panic in America about Ebola. the Obama administration deserves great credit. Not only did we totally contain it within the United States, but America did a great job of working with Liberia so that it was the most successful company. And I will tell you this notion that we should ban people with Ebola from coming here, et cetera. Let me tell you, if Ebola had broken out in Israel, Ireland, or Italy, you would not have heard calls for banning people with Ebola from coming here. There was racism at work there.
Please thank Congressman Barney Frank.